Good afternoon. It's my privilege to welcome Brian Etheridge, who is the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University today. Brian earned his dual undergraduate degrees at Georgia Tech in History and International Affairs. Went on to earn a master's degree at the University of Georgia, where he worked with Bill Stoup, and then on to the Ohio State University, as I'm instructed to call it, where he worked with Michael Hogan and Peter Hahn, two of the leaders in the field of U.S. foreign relations. He joined the faculty in the fall of Louisiana Tech in the fall of 2002, where he has served widely and extensively in a variety of capacities, including his current position as the director of the honors program for the university and as the research director of the American Foreign Policy Center. In addition, he serves in the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations as the webmaster and editor of the website Schaefer.org, and currently also serves as the chair of the Schaefer Nominating Committee. We don't really have time to read through his entire list of responsibilities. His business card is about the size of a legal pad. Suffice to say, he is very good at what he does and is in great demand. His scholarship is equally distinguished. He is a specialist in U.S.-German relations in the 20th century. He's written a number of articles and contributed to another number of anthologies dealing not only with U.S. foreign relations, but also with public diplomacy. His article, The Desert Fox, Memory Diplomacy and the German Question in Early Cold War America, was published by Diplomatic History in 2008 and was the recipient of the Stuart L. Bernath Scholarly Article Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations in 2009. A book he co-edited, The United States and Public Diplomacy Toward an International History, was published just this month, this week, and can be had for the mere price of $140. He also has another book manuscript from which this talk derives, Nazis and Berliners, Germany's Story in Cold War America. He has received a number of prestigious fellowships and grants, and in 2005 was voted as Louisiana Tech's best professor by the student body. So I will turn the time over to Brian Etheridge.
Stay on? Can you guys hear me through this? Yes? Okay. Great. Wow, Andy, thanks. I don't know how to follow that up. I am honored to be here. I've been treated magnificently since I arrived yesterday. This is an incredible resource. I know there are a lot of students in the room. I hope you realize and appreciate what you have here. I envy, not because you're about to sit at this talk, but I envy you because you have the opportunity to have access to all these wonderful people that come and speak to you on a regular basis. I know many of you are here for a class, probably because you're told to be here, but take advantage of the opportunities that you have. You'll kick yourself later if you don't. Okay? I'm really excited to talk about my research today. This is, as Andy said, part of an ongoing project. I'm in the finishing stages. I'm tweaking it, I'm polishing it up right now. And so I want to present kind of a basic overview of how I'm dealing with this issue, how I conceive of the problem, what solutions, ways of approaching it that I've developed. And at the end, I hope you have some time to hear your feedback, because I'd really be interested to hear if this makes sense to you, and if you can see any flaws in the way that I've approached the problem. So what is the problem? Well, I thought I'd start with this. Does anybody recognize a pattern here? Yeah? Well, they're all movies, right? These are all movies, all popular films, and they all deal with a common subject, right? They deal with Germany or Nazism in some form or another. The film that's kind of halfway obscure, that's Quentin Tarantino's last film, which I would not recommend for an accurate history of what happened. So the problem for me, the question that I see is why is Germany's story, the story of Germany, so prevalent in our society? And why has it been so? I would argue that no other nation's story has been more prevalent or popular in the United States than Germany's. And part of it's understandable because of the centrality of Germany's role in World War II and the role that Germany played in the subsequent Cold War. But in investigating this and trying to figure out what other factors might be at play, I've found that this is a very complicated issue. And I've wrestled with different ways to approach it and try to tackle the problem of exploring this, because it's not just in film. Maybe I need to, is this scratching a lot? Okay. So it's not just in film. Have any of you asked yourself, why do we have a Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.? I mean, have you ever wondered? And now some of it might seem self-evident, but in the nation's mall that's about American history, we have a monument to something that happened in Europe. Is there a piece of the Berlin Wall here on BYU's campus? A lot of campuses have some piece, usually a slab of it. And you can find it. You can find pieces of the Berlin Wall across the country. Why? What is it about that story that we feel like, as Americans, we need to memorialize or commemorate or celebrate? And so, for me, the question, as I started to look into this and ask critical questions about it, I realized that there are several things that are going on here. So the problem, the question, as I frame, is, okay, why is this so prevalent? Why is this story, why do we see it coming up again and again? Even in our political debates, right? The debate over health care. Both sides have accused the other of being a Nazi. Why? Why do we reach for that immediately? What about that is so compelling as a shorthand for denigrating or attacking a political enemy? So that's the way I frame the problem, and now I want to talk a little bit about the general frame of the solution, I guess, not really a solution, but a way that I've addressed it, and talk about some specific examples and try to illustrate for you how this approach is working for me. So does that make sense? It's kind of I still find it a fascinating problem. Okay, so what I've done is, when I started this project, I looked for models, other things other scholars have done with similar issues, to try and help me answer this question. Okay, why is it so prevalent, and why are there certain stories that we hear more often than others? And the first place I looked was literature on public diplomacy. As Corey said, this is a burgeoning field right now, both in terms of contemporary practice, looking at what states are doing now, and looking at what states have done historically to get their message across. And there are several different definitions for public diplomacy. There are several different terms for it. Some people call it propaganda. Some people call it psychological warfare. Others refer to it as cultural diplomacy. But the basic idea behind all of it is that you are using some kind of communication technology to get a point across to a public, right? And in the hopes that that public will then bring some pressure or influence to bear on their government that will be in line with what your foreign policy objectives are. So a lot of the stuff that we do today in the United States in terms of public diplomacy is we are appealing to other nations' peoples, and we're trying to convince them of what we're doing and it being right and in their interest, in the hope that they will then use that, be convinced of it, and then use that to convince their government to continue to support the American policy, or maybe to change their policy. That's the basic idea behind it. But most of the studies, as I looked at this as a model, I found were somewhat limiting, because what they do, a lot of the studies, is focus primarily on policy making. Okay, what do the people in the American government, or in the German government, or in the French government, what do they say, what do they argue about in formulating their strategies for getting their message across? That's primarily what the studies are about. What kind of messages do they want to get across, and how do they develop those messages, and then how do they implement them? Very little is dedicated to understanding how those messages are actually received. What do people think when they watch a program that's been crafted by a government? What do people think when they read a pamphlet that's been crafted by a government? Do they respond in the way that governments want them to respond? Now, governments, when they measure this is often done kind of on a very kind of basic axis. Did it work or did it not work? You know, and oftentimes, unsurprisingly, governments in their reports to their superiors find that it did work because they want more money, right, to continue doing what they're doing. So that's not the most reliable way to assess what is actually happening with these cultural products. So I found that model a bit limiting. So I started to look around for other ways to think about casting my project or getting inspiration for how to tackle this issue. And as I was looking at some of the products that are out there in the Cold War about Germany, I found, not unsurprisingly, that many of the narratives or stories about Germany deal with, even if it's not the explicit focus, they have to deal with Germany's past, right? I mean, because that's just something that's unavoidable. They have to somehow account for what the Nazis have done. And so that led me to start considering work in this field of study called public memory or collective memory. And this type of work is really influenced by the social and behavioral sciences. And what it says is that, you know, when you think about, when you remember something, the way we used to think about memory was that it was this process of total recall, right? If you hear a song and it reminds you of something where you were at a particular time, you somehow go back in the back of your brain, right? You kind of go back to a vault back there and you pull it out and you bring it to the front of your consciousness, and that's how your brain works. Well, a lot of the research shows that's not exactly accurate. That it's more of a process of reconstruction. So you have kind of bits of things in the back of your mind, and you kind of have to reassemble it if you want to recall a memory. And what they argue is that because it's a process of reconstruction when you remember something, what is going on in society around you helps to influence how you remember things. So it's also a very social process. And so that's the reason why you have these intense debates about how you memorialize an event that happens. Because in the future, for people who went through the event, and certainly for subsequent generations, that's going to be an important marker for shaping how people think about a past event. You know, that's kind of what the general thrust of the research is. And so for me, that made a lot of sense. Okay, that's a way of understanding when a movie's out there about Germany's past. A way to understand, okay, what people do with that and how they make sense of that. But at the same time, a lot of this research, it has kind of the opposite problem of public diplomacy stuff. And it doesn't really focus that much on the debates and the politics behind this stuff getting out there in the first place. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to merge the best of both for me and my project, and I've called it very unimaginatively memory diplomacy. I just kind of took out the public and both parts and slapped the two phrases together. But what this helps me to do is it helps me to kind of divide this process into two. It's both the process of cultural production, making products, the debates, the strategies inherent in that, also the politics between different people who are interested in making the same kinds of stories or getting the same kinds of stories out there. Also, too, it helps me to understand, because what's different about my project than most public memory projects is that I'm talking about a foreign nation's memory in the United States. Right? Most public memory, if you read works about public memory in the United States, you're going to read about our memory of the Civil War, our memory of the Revolutionary War, our memory of Vietnam. These are commonly how we think of public memory. But here, we're talking about a foreign story that is highly visible in another country. And so how do we make sense of that? So what I've been able to get at all this is say, look, you know, what happens with public diplomacy is they are putting, what they're trying to do is they're trying to if you want them to accept positive memories of Germany, what they're doing is they're trying to make you think of the Germans like yourself, so you kind of adopt their story as your own as part of, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, as part of a broader Western story. And Nazism has this kind of an unfortunate chapter that takes place in this larger story. So that's kind of how that works on the production end. On the reception end, it allows me to look at specific instances where there are these products out there and then see how people respond, either through government information, which can be sketchy, as I alluded to earlier, or through instances where we have other forms of reception, such as movie reviews or audience preview cards or those kinds of things. So trying to get at both sides of what I see as a very complex story, both how these stories get out there and how people respond to those stories. Now, part of this is just kind of some terms that I came up with to help me make sense of all this. A memory actor is an individual or a corporate entity that is out there trying to push a particular narrative, memory story, or a memory of a nation. And so, as I'll go into in a few minutes, there are several memory actors that are active in the United States during the post-war period, trying to get people to think one thing or another about the Germans. A memory coalition is a group of actors who are either consciously or unconsciously promoting the same narrative, or basically the same memory. They're pushing the same ideas. Okay? And as I'll talk about, there are two big ones that I see during this time period. And finally, and this gets to the reception part, the communities of memory, I've found in trying to examine how people respond to a particular product that different groups respond differently. You guys have probably had the experience where you and maybe a significant other or a friend have gone to see a movie, and you come back and you talk about it afterwards, and you feel like you've watched completely different films. Has that ever happened? And it's because you're coming at those movies with different life experiences. You're coming at them with a different perspective. And I've found that can be broadened or generalized to looking at how it's not always ethnically bounded, but sometimes it is. For example, Jewish audience members sometimes view things the same way because of their shared cultural heritage. Same thing with World War II vets. They had a different perspective on watching a film about Germany or about the Nazis than people who didn't participate in World War II directly. So these are kind of ways that building on these concepts and ideas that I've read about in other scholarship, I've applied to my own research. So I have several conclusions that I've come up with, but I'll give you these up front and then try to show how these work in some specific examples. The first is that in certainly the early Cold War period, and even to an extent the 1960s, and I'm going to talk about those two periods, the attitude of the American government is crucially important. And in the early Cold War, it's because the government enjoys such legitimacy and such authority as the triumphant, champion of World War II, that the American people naturally believe it. They believe what they are told by the government. And so that gives them a great deal of leverage and influence in shaping what happens with other actors who are interested in saying something about the same topic. Okay? And that endures even during the 60s. It weakens during the 60s because of the unrest that I'll talk about, but it still endures and it goes on and reasserts itself in the 1980s and 1990s. As a product of that, the narrative that the government, the American government supports ultimately wins out, but as I hope to show, I hope to have time, there are some unintended consequences of that one narrative being more popular or more dominant than the others. Okay, so briefly now, one thing that's alarming for those of us who teach in the Cold War, and Andy can attest, is that students keep getting younger and younger every year, right? And so you guys who are freshmen, you were born after the Berlin Wall fell. So there's no way you can have, what's that?
So
yeah. So it's impossible for you to have any living memory of this. Actually, sophomores would be the same thing. You guys were born in 1990, right? 1990, 1991. So I mean, for us, for Generation X and early generations, that's terrifying because this thing actually shaped our lives substantially. For our formative years or for most of our lives. So I can't give you a lecture on the Cold War, but I don't want to assume that you know everything about it because many of you might not. Some basic issues that play into my story. Number one, obviously the Cold War is an event that consumes the United States following World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union have been allies during the war. They become adversaries. They've been allies during the war, they became adversaries afterwards, and that shapes all aspects of American society. There's a second Red Scare where people who are concerned about communist infiltration try to root them out. There is a celebration of America and American values. There is a desire among American families for security, especially in the emerging atomic age. There's a baby boom. historians think a lot of this stuff is like there's a revival of religion, there's or interest in religion, and that accounts for a lot of the films that you see from the 50s, like, the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that are going that are influenced by this Cold War. And that plays a major role in the story that I've been looking at. So with that context, let me talk about the first coalition. Okay, and most of these coalitions are formed during the war. I'm just going to say a few words about each, and I want to show you some examples of what I'm talking about, how these different interests can collide. So this first one is this coalition forms around this thing, or this way of presenting Germany that I call the Cold War narrative. And this is a story of Germany that fundamentally is focused on Germany as it is during the Cold War, which is, again, not very imaginative, right? But the focus is Germany as a defender of the Western world, as being on the front line, especially in Berlin. For those of you who maybe don't know, Germany is divided after the war into essentially East and West. The same thing happens with Berlin, which is inside of East Germany. And so they're right there dealing, especially during the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift, they're dealing directly with the defense of freedom. And this is something that's very powerful for Americans back home. They respond to that in a very positive way. When people who push this idea of thinking about Germany talk about World War II, they talk about it as an aberration in German history. They talk about the Nazis as, I wouldn't say a handful of people, but a limited number of people who were able to gain possession of the government and then essentially hoodwink the people, hijack the nation, and take them along this ruinous path. When the war ends, the way they describe it, the Nazis are eliminated and Germany is allowed to return to the family of Western nations. And so a lot of this, the way they push it is, especially on the American side, is they say, look, the Americans or the Germans are becoming like us. They were Western before, but now under our tutelage, under our help, they are adopting Western-style capitalism, they're adopting Western-style democracy, and as anybody knows anything about German history, they're very successful at it. And so the Americans want to hold them up as an example of, look at what our ideas can do for a people. Okay? Now, there are three kind of main actors that push this in society after World War II. The most important, as I alluded to earlier, is the American government. During World War II, it's not clear what the Americans are going to do with Germany when it's over. Roosevelt himself, Frank Roosevelt, nobody knows. There have been several books written about what his plans would have been for Germany afterwards. We don't know for sure. Roosevelt was a master at playing his cards close to the vest, and we don't know what he would have done if he had lived past the end of World War II. What we do know is that when he dies and he is replaced by Harry Truman, the United States embarks on a very definite course of reconstructing, rebuilding Germany with the idea of allowing it to recover and to prosper and to link it to the West and therefore help the rest of Europe regain its footing and become prosperous as well. And so with that mindset in the Truman administration, they worked very hard through several outlets, through public, through foreign policy pronouncements, through organs like the Department of State Bulletin, through interviews with media, through informal channels, even through relationships with Hollywood and the emerging TV industry, to encourage an image of Germans that is positive, that encourages Americans to kind of forget, not to entirely forget the Nazi period, but to understand that it was an aberration, that it wasn't something that was fundamental to who the Germans were. Now, there is something that's valuable about the Nazis, and it's part of the reason why I've thought about calling this whole project Nazis and Berliners, because the way the American government uses the Nazis is to say, look, what we're doing in the Cold War is but a continuation of this constant struggle we have had with totalitarian regimes. The Nazis were totalitarian. They were these really bad guys, these dictators, took over the country, oppressed their people, and are warlike. When they were eliminated, the Soviet Union emerged as the heir to that totalitarian threat. And so the Americans invoked the Nazis, but rather than linking them to the German people, they linked them to the Soviet Union. They linked them to Joseph Stalin. So that's how they use it, and that's the kind of message or story that they put out there through the different outlets they have at their disposal. The Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, which is born in 1949, as you might imagine, has a similar interest in presenting themselves as good guys, right? Because they are completely dependent on the United States for their security and their well-being, and they want Americans to think well of them. One of the smartest things they do, and I've spent a lot of time in their documentation, spent time in their archives looking at what they do to try and craft a message. One of the smartest things they do is, very early on, their first year kind of back in the saddle with a foreign office, is they hire a public relations firm, American public relations firm called the Roy Bernard Company. And the Roy Bernard Company is the two principal partners, Roy Blumenthal and Bernard Gittleson, are both prominent members of a Jewish organization called the American Jewish Congress. I'll say a few things about it in a minute. And it's a very savvy move because not only they hired an American public relations firm to help them negotiate the difficult terrain in the American media, but they hire an American Jewish public relations firm that not only knows how the American media work, but they also know the concerns, specific concerns of the American Jewish community. So it's a very savvy move, and it's one that pays off very well for them through the 50s and 60s. So you have one public relations firm, an American public relations firm, that carries out the bulk of the public diplomacy of Germany because they understand, they're sensitive to the concerns that might exist in American society at large, and the specific concerns of the Jewish community as well. Finally, there is a lobby group that is formed after the war called the American Council on Germany. These are Americans. These are Cold Warriors, people who believe with all their heart in America's mission to smash Soviet totalitarianism. They think Germany is an absolutely crucial part of that. And so they formed, and they don't really have a budget, but they are very well-placed journalists, media managers, editors, and also congressmen, and even, they're not official members, but members of the executive branch, who work together in concert to put out positive stories through American magazines, American television, and American radio. Their principal founder, their principal advocate, is a man named Christopher Emmett, who has his own radio show in New York and has, or was a very active propagandist on behalf of intervention during the war, and then on behalf of Germany after the war is over. So that's one group, and they're spinning this, or they're pushing this one narrative of Germany as good guys, and people that can be relied upon, that you can support in this war against the Soviet Union. The other side, you can see how unimaginative I continue to be, is they support this narrative of Germany that I just call, for lack of a better word, the World War narrative. These are guys who want the American people to continue to think of the Germans as the Nazi thugs they were encouraged to think of them as during World War II. And not to think of them as Western, or to think of the Nazis as an aberration, but to think of the Germans as fundamentally flawed. As they're being, and the suggestions or the ways of explaining this range from there's something defective in their class structure, there's something defective biologically with them, but there's something that's intrinsically warlike with these people, and they cannot be trusted. They might, after the war, say that they're sorry, and that they never supported Hitler, and that they were actually working against him, but they would argue, these guys would argue, you cannot believe it. They're working right now trying to undermine the American occupation in Germany, and they're going to do whatever they can to reassert their place on the world stage and make another grab for world power. The principal advocate on behalf of this narrative is this thing called the Society for the Prevention of World War III. It was formed during the war. It was led by a man named Rex Stout. who is oddly enough, the author of the popular Nero Wolfe detective novels. Turns out he was also a SEAL propagandist during the war, and he became convinced that the Germans, that they could not be trusted at all, and so he founded this organization. And during the post-war period, their job was they saw it as their mission, to put out stories of Germany that encouraged Americans to think of them as different and as incorrigible, as irredeemable, as a people that needed to be permanently kept under the heel of a more powerful nation, otherwise they would rise up and try again. Jewish groups I've found to be the most complicated, and I've spent a lot of time in Jewish archives. And what's complicated is that they all share some of the biases of the Society for the Prevention of World War III. They see, they know about what happens during the war with the Holocaust. They see after the war that there are troubling signs that Nazism is still around and that anti-Semitism is still around. But they don't know how to deal with it because they're worried that if they push too hard for a vengeful or an approach that comes across as out to get the Germans, and one that would be in direct contrast to the stated policy of the American government, they're worried that it might make their interests in America, the Jewish population, vulnerable. For a couple of reasons. Number one, there has been a historic link between communism, which obviously Soviet Union was, and Judaism. And so they didn't want to open up the door for people who were anti-Semitic to say that all Jews are communists because they're Bolsheviks, so they didn't want that to happen. They also were worried that because of what happened during World War II and a fairly significant spike in anti-Semitic attitudes during that time, that would return very quickly given if they were perceived to be outside of the mainstream. And the mainstream, as the government was defining it, was to be pro-German, or at least to be pro this Cold War narrative. So they really don't know how to handle it. They see there's a problem, they're worried about the problem, but they don't know what to do. The American Jewish Committee leads a group of Jewish groups that argue that their best case, the best course of action is to go along publicly with whatever the government says, but behind the scenes, through influential contacts, to try to convince the American government to pursue a fairly forceful peace and keep the Germans in line. The other group is led by the American Jewish Congress, and they get so fed up with how they perceive easily the Germans are getting let off, but they decide they need to initiate a media campaign to wake Americans up and to make them aware of the problems that are going on in Germany right now. Okay, so let me take a couple of examples. Those are the general coalitions that I have here. I'm going to take a couple of examples here and show you how the movies that I found are really useful for looking at these fault lines, because people start to argue about whether a movie should be made or how it should be made or what it should look like. First one I'm going to talk about is this film, The Desert Fox, which was released in 1951. A year previous to that, in 1950, the producer of the movie, producer and director and actually the screenwriter, this guy named Nunnally Johnson, who went on to make several films in Hollywood, actually approached the State Department and said, look, I'm thinking about making this movie about Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, the famous German war general. And he actually shared his script with the State Department and said, look, this is what I'm thinking about doing. It's based on this biography that's been written by a British brigadier general. What do you think? The State Department responded, it's a bad idea. Don't make it, because it makes Rommel out to be a good guy. And their concern, they said explicitly, our concern is that if you make this movie, it's going to appear in the Soviet Union and other parts like we're pro-Nazi, because you're celebrating the Nazis. It doesn't matter what Rommel does. I mean, Rommel, towards the end of Hitler's reign, does become disillusioned and participates, to what extent we're not sure, in the plot to assassinate Hitler that's talked about in Valkyrie, and he's forced to commit suicide rather than having his family basically killed. But we don't know to what extent that happens, or how involved he is, and how opposed he is to the Hitler regime. What the State Department says, we do know that opposition doesn't happen until the end, when it's clear the Germans are going to lose. So we think it's just a bad idea, and it's also a bad idea domestically for us, because it will make people think that the government and the Americans are supportive of this. So we think it's just a bad idea. Melanie Johnson also talked to Jewish groups about this. You think this is a big idea? And they said the same thing. It's a terrible idea. Don't do it. Don't move forward with this. If you do it, it will have very negative repercussions for us internationally and domestically. Melanie Johnson didn't care. He argued, no, what I'm arguing or talking about is totalitarianism. That's bad. And this is what happens to people in a totalitarian regime. So I thought I would show you a brief clip. This should work. I tried it earlier. This is the very end of the film, and it's quoting Winston Churchill, who in one of his volumes of World War II wrote a little bit about Rommel. This is quoting that, and it's something that one of the things that both the American government and the Jewish groups fixated on as being in really bad form.
But he deserved the salute to which I paid him in the House of Commons in January 1942. He also deserves our respect because, although a loyal German soldier, he came to hate his art and all his work, and took part in the conspiracy to rescue Germany by displacing the maniac and tyrant. For this, he paid the forfeit of his life. It was after war as modern democracy, every single place for human refuge.
So that's pretty positive. That's 6 years after World War II is over. And you're talking about this guy who killed a lot of allies as this person who is deserving of our salute and our support. And that's what the American government and the Jewish groups had problems with. They tried to stop it. What's interesting, when the movie comes out, reviewers don't like it either. They argue the same thing the American government does, is this actually flies in the face of totalitarianism. For totalitarianism to work as a concept, somebody has to be a bad guy. And Rommel would be a logical person to be a bad guy because he was Hitler's favorite general for a long time. So there's a great deal of politics, public diplomacy work, and also complex things going on in how people receive this film. All right, I know that I'm running out of time here. I wanted to show you guys one more thing. So one of the things, I want to contrast that very briefly to another film that is a lightning rod for politics, criticism, and debate in the 1960s, and that's The Judgment at Nuremberg, Stanley Kramer's famous film. This movie comes out in a time in which America, the way Americans think about themselves is starting to change and to shift. The civil rights movement is in full bloom by the early 1960s when this film comes out. The student movement is getting started. And problems in Cuba and Vietnam are making some Americans question the righteousness of the Cold War. And this is something that the makers of the film, Stanley Kramer and the screenwriter Abby Mann, explicitly wanted to play upon or to talk about in Judgment at Nuremberg, which is a film about a trial of 4 judges who are being tried for their complicity in the Nazi regime in the late 1940s, about the same time the Berlin blockade and airlift are taking place. And so in this film, and it's a star-studded cast, it's got Spencer Tracy, Burt Lancaster, the film is a very different document. And the premiere for it takes place in Berlin in 1961, December of 1961, a few months after the wall is built. And the American government tries to stop it from being shown there, the West German government tries to stop it from being shown there because they're worried in a very unstable and unsettled atmosphere that a movie like this is going to be critical of the Germans and the Americans will cause unnecessary complications. And so I just want to, I know we're almost out of time, but I just want to show you a couple of minutes of this and just give you a gist. This is the most famous scene from the film. And you saw me get it, didn't you? There. So let me show you a couple minutes of this.
I wish to testify. You have seen him do it.
So here,
He has done it here in his office.
the most important judge is condemning his defense lawyer.
He has
Confession.
that we sterilize men for the welfare of a country. He has suggested that perhaps the old Jew did sleep with the 16-year-old girl after. Once more, it is being done for love of our country. It is not easy to tell the truth. If there is to be any salvation for Germany, we who know our guilt must admit it, whatever the pain and humiliation. I have reached my verdict on the Etheridge case before I ever came into the court. I would have found him guilty whatever the evidence. It was not a trial at all. It was a sacrificial ritual in which Feldenstein, the Jew, was a helpless victim.
Your Honor, I must interrupt. The defendant is not aware of what he's saying. He's not aware of the implications.
I'm aware.
I'm aware.
My counsel would have you believe we were not aware of the concentration camp. Not aware. Where were we when Hitler began stripping his hate and right? Where were we when our neighbors were being dragged out in the middle of the night to drown? Where were we when every village in Germany had a railroad terminal where cattle cars were filled with children being carried out to their extermination? Where were we when they cried out in the night for us? Were we deaf, dumb, blind?
Your Honor, I must protest.
My counsel says you are not aware of the extermination of millions. He would give you the excuse. You were only aware of the extermination of the hundreds. Does that make us any the less guilty?
Okay, let's stop it there. So what's interesting, and I'll leave you with this, I have more I could talk about. What's interesting about this film and how it's received by Americans is that later in the decade, this idea, and it's mentioned often in this film, of the good German. The good German being someone who follows his or her orders, doesn't question what they're doing, and therefore is complicit in a disaster like the Holocaust. That makes its way to the American context. And the New Left, which emerges in full bloom by the mid to late 60s, they use this idea of the good German as a metaphor to describe what they see going on in their own society. And they say that they will refuse to do this, they will refuse to be part. I'll leave you with one quote. Todd Hitland, who's one of the most probably vocal observers on what happens or how the New Left views American society during the 60s, said, let's see here. He said, the Jewish Cold Warriors of the 50s and the early 60s were dead set on stopping communism precisely because they had failed to stop the Nazis. Whereas to me and the people I knew, it was American bombs, which was the closest thing to an immoral equivalent of Auschwitz in our lifetimes. We want to say there were some or many for whom the Holocaust meant that nothing, neither private satisfaction nor the nation's greater glory, could ever supplant the need for a public morality. There were many Christians as well as Jews who concluded that they would never end up good Germans if they could help it. So during the 60s, you see a very complex process by which this story that had been supported Americans and Germans being the same, and so therefore Germans being kind of redeemed because of their association with America. That becomes inverted in the 60s through documents, cultural documents like Judgment at Nuremberg, where America becomes associated with Nazi Germany and therefore implicated in the same kinds of crimes or capable of carrying out the same kind of horrors. I have more I could do, but I see that I'm out of time. I'm sorry I'm going a little bit over. I would be open to any questions that you might have on this, what I see as a very complex interplay between politics and culture.
If you want to stay for a few minutes, we've got a roving mic. Please just tell us your name and what you're studying, and then ask your question.
Those of you leaving, thank you for coming.
I just had a quick question. My name is Jonathan Pike. I'm studying international relations, probably. I had a question because I was born in 1986, so I'm somewhat part of the, not part of the Cold War generation. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think that growing up, I remember playing with both in the bathtub, and they were still Nazi Germany and US and things like that. So I grew up with this idea that Germany is always Nazi, and how do you suggest going about changing it to the current state of Germany today? I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
I mean, are you saying how is Germany, how did it evolve?
So I'm thinking that people of my generation, we always think of Germany, we think of Nazi Germany. Because of the film, because of what we grew up with.
Right.
How do we, I guess, go about changing our perception of Germany or Nazi Germany to the current?
Well, I think the way the German government would say that needs to happen is through contact with Germans. I mean, that's probably the best. And they have a very expansive Goethe Institute program where they have language training available not only in Germany but in these centers across the United States and across the world even. And their hope is that by people who grow up with that kind of, and a lot of times that view of all Germans as Nazis is something that might be passed down or shared within a family context or within a regional context. And that their argument has been consistently the best way to try and address that is to have people in contact with real Germans to see that that's not the case. But I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I mean, in addition to all the media stuff that they do, that they also are, it's a very real kind of exchange component to the success of combating some of these. But I mean, I didn't have time to talk about it. But, the German government is very worried about television programs like Hogan's Heroes. I don't know if you guys can watch that. Hogan's Heroes, or Combat, which was a World War II drama during the 1960s, a very gritty, realistic World War II drama. They're worried about how Germans are presented, and that they complain to CBS, they complain to networks about these representations. But in some ways, if there is a perceived need or a desire for these kinds of programs in a capitalist economy, that's what they're doing.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for your lecture. My name is Nathan Wirtz. I'm also an international relations student. Your subject, talking about these different films from the 50s and 60s, made me think of two films that have come out about the 9/11 attacks, United 93 and the World Trade Center. What are your opinions on how those are affecting our collective memory? And films and conservative country songs, and I'm sure some of us have heard, and things like that.
Well, I think that, well, the first thing is that as a historian, we work in the past. And so any conclusions or any ideas that I might say about current events, I reserve the right to change later, right? When the documentation comes out. I would say I would be willing to bet money that the government was, I wouldn't say involved, but consulted about those projects. I do think that there was, after 9/11, there was this kind of outpouring of support and this kind of this revived sense of patriotism that emerges. But what's also interesting to me is in the last few years you have had some films that have been very critical of the war and of previous wars. One that I'm thinking of in particular was like Jarhead. That was a very that's a very critical film. And so I think that the way that those films represent how we think about ourselves and our own past are going to continue to be influenced, obviously, by people who want a particular story to be out there, but they're also going to continue to evolve as world events do. And I think that's part of the reason why some films that have a more critical posture have emerged. But if the surge continues to be successful, who knows what the story or what the narratives will be about Iraq or about the Middle East. It's amazing, even now, just 9 years after 9/11, the extent to which that is fading for a lot of people, and the attempt at Christmas bombing. A lot of people are just that a lot of people, from my perspective, are not taking that very seriously. I'm surprised that hasn't got more media coverage than it did. And if it had worked, you better believe people would have got more media coverage. But it's just, so I think we've kind of fooled ourselves that was kind of almost an aberration, and this war is not still ongoing. There are still other people out there that are trying to kill us. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I can address it.
My name's Duncan. I'm a history major.
Okay.
I grew up completely entrenched in the Cold War narrative.
Okay.
And it was really interesting to hear it kind of parroted back to me, which you think is original thinking, and it's really not. But you mentioned that there were some unintended consequences that came with that kind of ideology. What were you
Well,
thinking?
and it's something I wasn't able to flesh out fully because of time constraints and people need to leave. But I think that, for example, this what happened with Judgment at Nuremberg is an acknowledgement that America and Germany are the same. I mean, and that's what they were trying to get across in the 40s and 50s, is that we want Germany to be rehabilitated, and the best way for that to happen is to tie them to us, because we have such legitimacy, we have such authority, we have such prestige in our country right now. I mean, I don't want to say that Americans followed their country blindly in the 1940s, 1950s, but in the wake of the war, what Harry Truman said. Now, I understand there was partisan politics, and you'll be the first one to point that out. But in general, there was a great deal of support, at least in terms of foreign policy, for what was said. And so, in linking Germany to the United States and making it a much broader Western story, that allowed Germany, in a sense, in terms of public relations, to be rehabilitated. Now, an unintended consequence of that is when perceptions in the United States of America start to go south because of the civil rights problems, because of the problems associated with Vietnam, because of the student unrest and the general unhappiness among some quarters with capitalism and what's going on campuses. That linkage allows them to then use Nazi Germany as a way to criticize America. And I spent a lot of time in one of my chapters talking about organizations like the Weathermen, which was a radical organization, a splinter group of the Students for Democratic Society, which is a very radical organization in the 60s. And they were all about Americans are Nazis. The American government is run by Nazis. They're fascists. I mean, the term fascist was used very liberally. The Black Panthers, another radical organization, referred to cops and authority figures as fascist pigs. So that allowed that for me, that one of those unintended consequences of that strong linkage. While it's positive for Germany in the 50s because they're tied to a very positive, or at least the perception of a very positive America. In the 60s, when America is the perception is more negative, they're able to use that language that had been reserved for Germany to criticize the United States. And I think there's still some of that today when we talk about the lessons of the Holocaust. And there are different camps, different scholars who argue why the Holocaust happened and how complicit Germans are. But one of the things, for example, the Holocaust Memorial Museum tries to get across to its visitors is that this could happen anywhere. This could happen here. It happened in Germany, but any place intolerance sets in, anytime bigotry sets in, you could get to a situation where people are persecuted and eventually exterminated. Does that make sense?
Professor Etheridge, I thought that was, thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate also how you're distinguishing public memory from popular memory and not going to the monuments as such, but going to the organizations to show us and tell us this kind of a story. The very astute question by our history major here, I thought, was excellent because it helped to throw into relief something I wasn't quite sure of at the beginning, which is, I think, how the narrative is used in the Cold War, but then also how it flips. Your question about why do we associate, as a political shorthand, Nazis as X. Very interesting to hook it to the Weathermen and other groups like that. My question, twofold, very brief. One, you showed us the Desert Fox. Would something like the Big Lift be the flip side of the Desert Fox, where we have a positive view that's fitting, I think, with the narrative you're saying? And secondly, if we, I guess the corollary to what's happening in the United States are precisely things like the RAF terrorist group in Germany, who also link then back to the US, right, where Nazis in the US are linked. Obviously your story is about the US, but that would just be...
No, that's very funny. Yeah, there is actually, and you're teaching a class on the Holocaust right now, right? Yes. There's an article that just came out in the American Historical Review. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about Holocaust films during the 50s. And they talk, I think it talks a little bit about the Big Lift. I do talk about the Big Lift. There's actually, there are several films, and an earlier version of this paper that I was going to present before I tried it out and knew that I needed to cut it. There are several films that are actually filmed on location, the Big Lift being one, with the assistance of the American Air Force. And yes, that narrative is more positive. It's Americans and Germans working together. And there's even kind of a few token bad Germans, and it's represented through these relationships. That I guess you've seen the film, right? That these flyers have with these German Fräuleins. What I found so interesting about all of these films, and there's the Big Lift, there's The Search, there's Berlin Express, there is A Foreign Affair. All of these films were actually filmed on site in Germany in the late 40s. And to be able to do that, you had to go through an incredible kind of bureaucratic process, because obviously the place is bombed to smithereens. And so it's occupied by the American military. And so to get to places to shoot things on location, you've got to have the right people kind of facilitating this for you. And that means that the government has a great deal of influence over what kind of stories are told. What's still interesting to me is when I read the reviews and the responses people had to all of these movies, what they responded to more than the actual messages in the films was the devastation of the landscape, the first thing. I mean, that they constantly come back. The rubble is unbelievable. And then one reviewer of the Berlin Express basically says there's two movies. There is this film where you've got all this rubble and it's this beautiful kind of haunting landscape, and there's this other story about these nations trying to get along, but that one just gets in the way of things really interesting. So they really respond to this devastated landscape. That's kind of what really pulls them in. The other thing, and I have a colleague, Petra Good, who's written about this, they really respond to the women, the German women, the representation or the thinking of Germany as a nation populated primarily by women, because a lot of men had died during the war. And that kind of makes them more protective of Germany, because they're thinking of Germany in a feminized way, as a nation of Fräuleins that need our protection. One of the things that was really kind of creepy to me, talking about using the term creepy, I was in Berlin doing research, and I came across a cache of documents that had been written to the governing mayor of Berlin, of West Berlin, and these were by Americans. And I found several letters written by American men asking, so they see these movies, they see these, a lot of magazines like Life have these pictures of beautiful German women on them. American men asking the mayor of West Berlin to set them up with a German girl. One guy was he said, I'm 50 years old, I'm looking for a wife. She has to be between 5'2" and 5'5", and weigh 120 pounds. She must be well built and good looking. Please send me pictures so I can have my pick. That's what he says. Utterly astonishing. For me, it was very illustrative of this perception that there is in America because of the way the movies are shot, because a lot of the films depicted love stories between American military figures and German women. That there was just all these women out there, gorgeous women that needed a husband. And so when I read that, I was like, wow. And I can't remember what the file was called. It was probably the equivalent of their crank file, where they put all this stuff, when they get it. But it was illustrative of a particular attitude. And it was again, an unintended thing. And I would never have known that if I hadn't gone looking for instances of reception. So, yeah, there are films out there that do this, but what I found even more interesting is that the American population kind of gravitates towards the things that they didn't even kind of expect, the policymaker or the filmmakers didn't intend to be the kind of the focal point of the film. You can comment.
So do you think that these movies are carried towards a primarily white male audience, right?
Yes.
So is there any equivalent for women, even if they're white women, or I understand that these things were co-opted by movies in the 60s, which is a cool idea. And how do you deal with the fact that in some ways you're setting up a binary where you've got on one side people who want to defend Germany, on the other side people who want to attack Germany. I'm trying to get the actual question, which I can't remember what it was, but
well, part of your question is it overly simplistic, I think, and I think that is a valid concern. It's something that I've wondered about, or I'm worried about even more appropriately, because is it kind of make it too simple, too cut and dry? There's these guys that are for Germany, they're spitting this figure saying there's these guys who are against it. But as I've tried to go through and look at all the reading instances of popular culture, in magazines or in films or on the radio where I can find those as kind of ephemeral. You do find they tend to clump in because a lot of it's politically driven, and so they're interested either in supporting Germany or they're interested in instituting greater controls over Germany. So, I think that's something that is worrisome, and maybe it does take out some of the complexity, but I still think that at its core there are kind of two basic ways of thinking about it, and all the other narratives kind of flow from those two basic positions.
Is there any equivalent of maybe romance novels for women or something where there's the same cultural influence coming from Germany? Are these voices expressed in other forms of pop culture, I guess?
You mean the narratives of Germany? There's like an explosion, like romance novels set in Germany.
Nordic, people who are guys.
Yeah. I haven't run across any instance of Fabio, in the 90s. But I know what you mean, and part of it might be where I'm looking. And part of where I'm looking has been dictated by the organizational documents that I've been looking at. And they're most concerned about the really highly visible media products like your films, like your television shows, the ones that they think, and because those are such complex products to put together anyway, you got to film things on location, so you need permission from some government to do that. You've got, it's a process that takes a year at least, and so that allows for participation by different actors to get involved or insert themselves. Like the Jewish organizations, the umbrella Jewish organization had a representative in Hollywood. His job was to kind of vet all these scripts. So we kind of bounce around from all among all the studios to try and catch what they're doing. So there might be some instances like that, or even like alternative fiction. That might be another way to kind of think about other ways that this is being interpreted. So I agree there are some things probably out there that I'm not or haven't addressed yet.
I like the way you look at research and questions, but I also want to address the critical one.
No. I want that. I want people to.
Thank you.
Thank you.